Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is third in a series of 5 sending a note-by-note dissection of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 1. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly analysis, its massive journey aspires to scan the entirety of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me when I hope I'll be able to complete. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check the first video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the bottom stave of page 38, immediately following Alberich's anguished cries at being snubbed by Flosshilde, the third Rhine Maiden. His pain inspires a momentary wave of sympathy for the beleaguered Nibelung, but it's banished with a trill appoggiatura on massed woodwinds beneath first violins, rushing up a semiquaver triplet scale into a hard orchestral sting. This bundle underlines the very sexual gratification which has just now been categorically denied to him on every side. Moved by it, he launches a brief tirade against their schmählich, schlaues, liederlich, schlechtes behavior, with its trug and treulos. He has a point, for the nymph's bad conduct towards him personally is undeniable, and it goes hand in hand with their irresponsible neglect of their primary duty, meaning to protect the Rhinegold, resulting in catastrophe for the world. His quasi-recitative vocal, underlined by only 3 sharp quaver string chords, lifts on reverse chord notes to move down reverse melody notes broken into a pair of reverse chord notes similar to his frustrated wooing, though here parsed as consecutive inverted whirldash intervals. They are followed, after a descending third, by their longer version, to rise on a 5th, making it another quasi-heroic strophe, topped by chord notes, itself an echo of him. After a quaver rest he follows with the Rhine Maiden phrase, thus pairing his fierce resistance with his expectations confounded by the nymphs, which he eloquently completes on a last defiant iteration, reverse melody notes, and a pathetic falling minor third. To an audience unfamiliar with the Ring, this all has a powerful sound, but for those conversant in the syntax, it also foreshadows the twistings to which Wotan's spear is subjected in its long history of frustration. First violins answer in puckish delight, sliding up a chromatic tuplet semi-quaver scale, only to plunge back down at its crest into an extended wave, while seconds and violas add triplet semi-quaver tuplet pulses, a woodwind trill appoggiatura with flutes joining halfway through the measure. Its hint of sexuality launches the Rhine Maidens' next wholly gratuitous taunting, a concerted number that blends their tight harmonies in apparent violation of opera and drama rules, which might be excused on the premise the nymphs effectively function as a single individual. In all events, their words are usually unintelligible, which is the whole reason the Meister forbade such passages, and no contemporary director has done anything more with it than place the maidens in some picturesque arrangement, then have them emote, arms waving, until the next thing deemed worth staging rolls around. Such neglect confirms that, to traditional eyes and ears, this sequence is a pointless longueur, the sort of puffery Wagner famously condemned throughout his career. Yet nothing could be further from the truth, for this passage serves a number of meaningful narrative purposes. First, underlining the nymphs' total ignorance of true empathetic love, to stress all they really understand is mindless frolic, while painting an indelible image of Erda's natural order as both seductive and implacably cruel. By inference, we must also conclude their unnamed yet far wiser elder has seen fit to educate them no further than this. In the midst of it all, the ensemble's syntax bristles with morphemic germs, modules which eventually play important roles all across the epic. For that reason alone, the passage's vocal is reproduced in its entirety. It reflects all Rhine Maiden ensembles to come, many of whose elements are syntactic modules already heard during this first scene of the work. It begins on 3 rising triads, which also introduce its coda. While it's too early to thoroughly discuss the repercussions of this embryonic morpheme, it's clear at the outset it embodies the Rhine Maidens' deliberate frustration of love's urge, their effective abandonment of the one seeking love, a function the rising triad has already served during the scene, though in a strictly embryonic sense. Meanwhile, the passage is fraught throughout with falling, rising, quasi-long, short, long leaps of 3 notes, those on thirds playing a key part in Alberich's fruitless pursuit of the nymphs during the soon-to-follow mute pantomime. Meanwhile, 2 of them have already sounded both in the dwarf's lust and the nymph's vocals jeering him, all derived from Flosshilda's original warning against this threat to the gold, and all a specific variant on the triads both rising and falling, which play their own key roles in the work's syntax. Thanks to the bitterness they inspire in Alberich, these gather unexpected importance in the drama's continuing syntax. The modules amongst the epic's most influential are reverse melody notes, whose delicate interplay with the original rising versions, so predominant in the prelude, have already exerted a subtle influence on Scene 1, their bundles of associations clarified only as the tetralogy's syntax evolves, their key lurking in the Vala's plans for the world, both opposing and exploiting those forces aligned against her as they struggle for power through control of the world's populations. The opposing signs created by their juxtapositions figure solely in Alberich's previous vocals, his indiscriminate reproductive urge here eventually crystallizing into warring factions. The concerted numbers middle section develops these ideas with the melody notes themselves, intermixed with 2 reversals of the initial rising triad, this falling version with its own growing sexual racial associations, and a 4-note extension of the reverse melody notes, followed to cap that phrase by the rising originals themselves. Perhaps the ensemble's most enigmatic detail is its evocation of the giant turn, itself built from an opposition of reverse melody notes with their originals. The entire gist of this tease for the dwarf is the impossibility of mingling his species with theirs, and this idea of fusing the world's breeds goes on to play a major role in the drama, with the melody notes and the turns built from them being key modules in that process. Also worth noting is that the reversals outnumber its original by 2 to 1, which seems paradoxical if the Rhine Maidens are meant to be creatures of Erda. But it should be remembered their taunting only exacerbates Alberich's longing to mate with them, as suggested by the dominance of the reverse melody notes. Meanwhile, the passage concludes on what is by now a familiar module drawn from the primal Rhine Maiden lullaby tune, as later taken up in Alberich's sexual elation and often repeated in vocal lines thereafter. As a final note, their ensemble is fraught throughout with the signature long-short-long rhythmic pulse, a pillar of Ring musical DNA. The orchestral accompaniment appears to be simplicity itself, bookended by full strophes of Welgunde's lullaby melody, in high woodwinds floating on first and second violins that trade wave pulses. But something decisive is added. During the initial section of the nymph's teasing vocal, sung to nonsense syllables, violas sustain a long trill which ends leaping up an octave on its appoggiatura during the lullaby melody's terminal chord notes, to be answered by a short trill appoggiatura on first violins, announcing that portion of the ensemble during which the Rhine Maidens sing recognizable words. In the course of their texted vocal, violas trace rising arpeggios on the first half of each measure, interspersed, as each longer phrase ends, with single rising-falling signs that fill their individual measures. Throughout, violins supply constant pert trillopagituras on the final half of each measure, lightly punctuated on the first and last beat by staccato quaver woodwind chords. An elusive syntactic clue sounds as this middle section nears its end, the maidens singing a pair of reverse melody notes capped by descending fourths, in echo of similar cells earlier in the passage. This module, with its growing sense of racial impetus, forms the backbone of much Rhine Maiden syntax, which is subtly emphasized by woodwinds, oboes taking the melody as they double the second pulse, the only time they trace the ensemble's melodic contour. This introduces the lullaby again in its entirety on high woodwinds as it presages and completes the return of their nonsense syllables. As it rounds off the passage, the violin choir resumes trading waveforms, this time both first and seconds filling their intervening gaps with trillopagituras, as violas lapse into a sustained one-note tremolo. The frothy whole perfectly images the nymphs' playfulness, their maddening blend of unavailability and hypnotic allure, along with the intense sexual charge building in Alberich as this teasing raises his level of infuriated frustration. To end the concerted passage, violas race up 2 measures of echoing chromatic scales as violins quiver on a long trillopagatura, all terminated abruptly as the sustained woodwind horn chord atop them breaks off its harsh crescendo to leave viola's cellos humming on fingered tremolos that evoke Loge in support of the dwarf's passionate aside. Porter's singing translation is slightly altered here, and in any case is more accurately rendered by Spencer Millington. Just as they've done in his previous wooing, the dwarf's insidious references to fire conjure Loge, spirit of life energy, of mind, of inspiration, and, as Donington points out, libido with an element of violence. Sung entirely over low strings and Loge-like fingered tremolos, clarinet minim chords off the beat pulsing the last 3 full measures, the line begins on 2 echoing figures built from reverse air-to-chord notes opposed to their originals. However, the second pulse expands by making its reverse notes a low ash interval, to then expand with an iteration of the melody notes, giving the dwarf's indictment the force of natural power. Yet it's capped by a falling third, so the line aptly resembles chagrin, while by rising a heroic fifth, it creates a distinctive long-short-long module finished by chord notes. This unique bundle then echoes twice, with a slight but telling alteration that intensifies it as the falling third acquires the sinister force of octaves, followed by chord notes, a phrase Alberich concludes by rising on Erda's heroic final notes, only to cap it with the resistance of reverse chord notes. Outside Bühler, the analytic tradition has no perception of the octave, yet whose falling incarnation here implies the offense against nature the dwarf longs to commit, while recalling its insidious presence in the bass line of his first appearance, his initial wooing, and several times thereafter, always in conjunction with Alberich's bad intent. Meanwhile, Newman opines the chord notes generically imply laments of one kind or another, a connotation Cook feels is all but universally reflected in tonal music by a host of different composers across the ages. Yet in this first scene alone, they suggest Alberich's lust, his physical exertions to win the Rhine Maidens, Flosshilda's wooing, the dwarf's anguish over his sexual frustration, and, earliest of all, the nymph's primal nature. Together, these seemingly contradictory indicators only coalesce if they're read as the Earth Mother's power directing nature's energy both towards positive and negative outcomes. Meanwhile, the chord notes' contributions to the dwarf's current tirade imply a passionate hunger to capture his tormentors in service of his potent sexual needs, his vocal built on defiant chord note reversals, opposed by their originals. So much more than lamentation, along with chords which spawn them, the chord notes suggest nature's energy pulsing through the world and everything in it, guiding it towards as yet undisclosed changes. The current sequence also implies Loge, Erda's lieutenant and architect of the Rheingold trap, nudging the furious dwarf towards slaking his vindictive longings to his ultimate disadvantage, a struggle the Earth Mother fuels to reach her desired outcome, that being Alberich's rape of the gold, which in itself is only the first step towards what can only be a far more inclusive agenda. 4 blaring syncopated horn woodwind chords, echoes of the clarinet English horn pulses which have only just driven his vocal, interrupt the dwarf's fuming to ramp up its power and launch his final outburst, his vow to have one of the maidens. Fingered string tremolos continue their Loge whirl as he howls an echo of his previous cell, this time stressing its bouncing module, which has acquired more weight thanks to its prominence in Flosshilda's rejection. After a quaver pause, he continues through a reverse ash interval on chord notes and a retrograde of the nymph's primal lullaby cell. Its falling triad made a rising one of betrayal and abandonment. Riding the string tremolos as they ascend, he finishes with a stridently expanded chromatic melody note ascent, capped by a raw falling octave to make his line another reminder of the nymph's duplicity. It triggers a pedal chord on those same braying horn woodwinds to launch the chase pantomime in which Alberich pursues the Rhine Maidens. This symphonic sequence, the first purely orchestral passage since the prelude, begins on what seems mere pictorialism, yet which is rich in syntax. This figure reproduces every stave of the orchestra, though merging the initial woodwind chord on a single stave. Viola's violins surge up from their pedal tremolos on a minor seventh semiquaver arpeggio, suggestive of the dwarf's leap into his scrambling ascent of the river's crags. Violas suggest that clamber, bustling darkly on 2 iterations of the dwarf's prior complaint against Velgunda, whose words disparaging his physical gifts are rebutted here by his athletic climb. As befits the work's developing syntax, this figure, with its chromatic retrograde of the elongated melody notes and final minor rising third, bears a passing and tartly ironic resemblance both to his personal motif and Flosshilda's heroic module. To begin each viola pulse, cellos repeat offset strophes of the Rhine Maiden's frisking shape, here distorted by the persistent minor seventh harmony. These 2 lines create an interwoven series of unnatural down-up sine waves until violas break their motion with a single reverse melody note pulse to be joined by cellos rising on a trio of falling triads, imparting a sense of the dwarf's upward movement, one fraught with his urge to procreate. This syntactic bundle then repeats, lifted a whole tone, with second violins joining the viola's complaint figure as cellos resume their Rhine Maiden distortions. Viola's violins break the complaint shape, again on reverse melody notes to rise in another 3 falling triads, reaching climax on a stronger opposition of melody notes with their reversals. As a last elusive note, cellos support the upper string triads with 3 chained iterations of that taunting cell, which has only just assisted Flosshilda's ultimate taunts, further linking it to the dwarf's frustrated lust. Stage directions for this initial phrase of the pantomime instruct the Nibelung to scale the riverbed flanks mit grauenhafter Behendigkeit. Yet, over the last decades, productions universally opt for various sluggish games of tag, the feet of nymphs and dwarves planted firmly on the stage floor, vitiating the syntactic message. Its interplay of reverse melody notes and falling triads contributes to a developing grasp of Nibelung vitality and sexual resolve, an energy that's destined to boil over from dwarves into the gods, thus shape much of the coming narrative. After the key change, contrabasses thump a single falling octave as woodwind horns answer this first assault with the nymph's playful ensemble module, followed by 2 upward bouncing measures of the lullaby, whose combined chain of 4 iterations also yields 3 rising triad strophes, to oppose the falling version which dominates Alberich's scramble. Their intent, of course, is to abandon the dwarf to his hopeless lust. Above violas rushing up a repeated series of chromatic scales grounded in a horn pedal, a flute-clarinet bundle carols the lullaby's delight, oboes, bassoons added in a rising pair of its third bounces. Violas quiver a trill appoggiatura beneath the final third bounce, while violins, cellos rise climactically on a demi-semiquaver diatonic scale into a brusque chord across all orchestral voices. These measures correspond to stage directions instructing the Rhine Maidens in continued mockery, which seems to goad the dwarf into a misstep. In response to the harsh chord, contrabasses thump a falling octave, urging the rest of the string choirs to 3 brash descending semiquaver chromatic scales harmonized in thirds that evoke the downward portions of Alberich's personal morpheme, never mind Loge inversions. Viola's cellos finish with a slower line, paradoxically incorporating the Rhine Maiden rhythm. All this paints the dwarf's hapless struggle and plunge back to the river floor. Thanks to the nymph's ironically slipshod attention to their real duties, this swift form of the long-short-long pulse, a seemingly chance detail here, attains huge significance to Alberich and his Nibelungs, and expressly because it begins life as typical of the Rhine Maiden's taunts. A contrabass pedal underlines Wellgunde's seductively duplicitous appeal on delicate woodwinds, 2 complete pulses, then 4 iterations of its descending cell. This gentle urgency atop the flawless syntactic logic of an extended viola-cello trill appoggiatura, with its magical sonic infusion of eroticism, is meant to goad the dwarf to renew his efforts. It won't be long until the Wellgunde's syntax low-ash interval echoes in the Rheingold fanfare, that primeval fount of natural energy so like the world ash. The difference here is that, as with the nymph's imperfect guardianship of their treasure, the gold is created not pure, but programmed for betrayal through its irresponsible custodians, who thoughtlessly tease what they see as no more than a feeble pawn into swelling his powers until he becomes an irresistible foe. Alberich resumes his scramble up the rocks, semiquaver violas, cellos supporting bassoons, in a sonic embodiment of his renewed climb, a strophe of the dwarf's recent complaint. As it turns back on itself in melody notes, capped by its module-generating cell, here complete with its chord notes, cellos descend on triads, then scurry up rising chromatic scalar modules, 2 per measure, while 2 horns join semiquaver violins in 3 furious pulses, whose rise outlines the diminished minor 7th harmony. This module, part of the dwarf's previous angry vocal, distorts and develops its immediately prior module, its falling intervals relentless downward octaves, finished by chord notes. Second violins, then clarinets, then first violins progressively join this baleful syntactic parcel as it telescopes into a livid set of 5 consecutive plunging octaves, rising by minor third intervals. They're crowned in another tantalizing pulse of the abbreviated lullaby, piccolos added, followed with 2 rising third bounce pulses. The nymphs maddeningly just out of reach, their sexual allure pinpointed by a trill appoggiatura, capping the module in flutes piccolos. Beneath it, pizzicato violins fall an octave, echoed in contrabasses as cellos, violas slide down 2 chromatic scales, now harmonized in 6th, only to rise again on a module whose variations dominate the next bars. The long-short-long pulse merges the triads, launching the Rhine Maidens ensemble with chord notes to produce a ring fragment inversion, followed by a single rising triad, initiating the pantomime's gradual climax. This first clambering form surges up to slide down 2 more chromatic scales, second violins added, then repeats, pitches raised a third, first violins joining its next downward scale reduced to 1 pulse only, followed by a single rising pulse of the taunting module. The shortened bundle repeats once, after which its falling scale elongates into a series of 5 on full string choir, each subsequent pulse raised a third. The last 3, losing cellos, rise to a climactic chordal sting across massed woodwind strings. With a swift grace, woodwinds burst into a giggling taunt strophe, its bounce doubled in rising a third, and ended by falling precipitately on an elongated ring fragment like arpeggio, a wildly grace-dotted crotchet string chord halfway through it, which then plunges through a semi-quiver scale of 3 triplets to conclude the pantomime with another harsh sting, heaviest in strings. Taken together, this final passage of the interlude fits its stage instructions like a glove. Alberich almost reaches the Rhine Maidens when he falls back down again. While no production available to this viewer honors the Meister's instructions, Wagner's cinema-like vision crafts this entire wordless interlude to precisely outline the requested stage action note by note. Banishing any idea Rheingold lacks sophistication, the sequence is unprecedented not merely in Wagner's earlier works, but in all prior opera, literally inventing a school of theatrical music whose flood of innovation still pulses through world culture to the moment of this writing, with no signs of abating. Cinema flippantly dubs it Mickey Mousing, after the precise synchronization of action to music, first popularized by Disney's animated films of the 1930s. Throughout the 20th century's first half, Wagner's innovations pervaded cinematic scores thanks to a wave of conservatory-trained composers, both European and American, flooding Hollywood, from Korngold to Steiner, Waxman, Friedhofer, Stalling, Herrmann, and many others steeped in the Wagnerian tradition. Those interested are particularly encouraged to study the work of Carl Stalling, whose Warner Brothers animators cooperated with him in the kind of precise staging Wagner dreamed of but never achieved. The work of all these artists galvanized audiences for decades, a tradition continued to this day by film musicians from Williams to Horner to Polidorus to Desplat, among many others. Even with countless wrinkles suited to a host of different musical and dramatic paradigms, these techniques still inform cinematic scores of every stripe. The roots for them all may be found in Rheingold, with this pithy interlude a prime example, Mickey Mousing's first bow to world culture.
Jochen lacht und lügt, lüstern lächtig nach euch, und einem muss mir liegen.
After his fall, the dwarf howls his frustration to reverse melody notes, then the nymph's rising triad of betrayal, its last note punctuated by another forceful quaver string chord which launches a soft timpani roll. Above this, still energetic woodwinds answer laughingly with a taunt, this time expanded with its own rising triad, at which point the mood changes on the spot. Like a muted voice from another world, the bass trumpet breathes a muted fanfare, a regal static ash interval. Woodwinds respond again with a slightly faded taunt pulse. The bass trumpet breathes another static interval, triggering a last and still feebler woodwind taunt. The bass trumpet's next static interval reduces the woodwind still further, leaving only the taunt's final cell, capped by a rising air de fourth. After a final trumpet static interval, only oboe, clarinet, and English horn remain to whisper a last taunt, its rising pitch now a third, as if the nymph's hilarity is finally tamed. It's worth noting these last two reductions also stress the taunting syntax's fundament, that being a static ash interval. The stage directions are clear what this means to convey visually. An increasingly bright glow penetrates the floodwaters from above. The Meister wants this to be a gradual process per the word increasingly, depicting the sunrise as it penetrates the depths with successively more powerful rays of light. On a gentle harp strum, 6 first violins commence a soft divisi triplet quaver pulse. This figure's close identity to one of Loge's key morphemes should be noted, with its links to the Erda chords and chord notes. Yet more evidence for the fire god as parent of the gold's custodians, never mind his commission as part of Erda's plans. The Rhinegold itself, the fire of rivers, per its original mythic appellation. The gold seems to appear only gradually, though its morpheme declares immediately on a solo French horn. The gold strictly diatonic shape launches on a low ash interval, rising in air de fourth, meaning 2 pulses on its low rather than high note, a detail it immediately repeats without syncopation. Cook observes its final notes sketch the last morpheme-generating Erda melody notes, though it should be noticed they extend to echo the Rhine Maidens' earlier mocking triad, with its sign of abandonment, a subtle clue to the gold's approaching fate, one which is integral to its own syntactic texture. Taken together, these sonic hints suggest the gold is indeed a kind of trap, one closely related to the maimed world ash, its purity all too corruptible, hiding within itself vast power, but also the seeds of its own theft, one that inflicts another dire wound to the natural world. It's also another of the work's few morphemes whose reference to the gold no analyst doubts. The horns sound the Rheingold tattoo 4 times, a horn added at a diatonic harmonic interval with each successive pulse, to emphasize it's meant to appear before an audience's eyes only gradually. Interspersed with each Rheingold statement, the nymphs trade admiring comments portraying the gold as if it were a living being, that lacht, is Schläfer, whose eyes the sun kisses, dass es öffne, stressing its kinship with the world ash, itself a living entity. Each of their vocal lines ostensibly mimic the initial falling-rising module of the original lullaby, Voglinde's first line doing so most exactly, along with a static ash interval ended with a flippant taunt cell. On closer examination, these vocals fall and rise more uniformly, with fewer of the lullaby's many small downward-upward twists, making them more like the world ash melody. Velgunda's begins by opposing a rising triad to a falling one, then after a crotchet rest, closely echoing the finish of Voglinde's, a delicate grace on its final note. Flosshilda sings an almost pure world ash melody, albeit capped by chord notes, and Velgunda's second line begins with the notes to fall an octave, then rise a sixth. As a passing note, she thus voices a distorted retrograde of a cell previously featured in several vocals, one to have pivotal meaning for the gold's future. This triggers the third and last harmonized Rheingold tattoo as the violin choir, having gradually expanded its quaver triplet loge pulses into 8 separate lines on 2 instruments each, more than doubles in speed to semi-quaver triplets. The octave in Wellgunde's vocal seems paradoxical until one thinks of what soon becomes of the gold, and she finishes with an even more perfect outline of the ash melody, all signs of the gold's primally vulnerable power. Vogelinde's final line rises on the heroic final melody notes to move through a truncated version of Alberich's woeful cry, then a rising triad to finish on a syncopated taunt cell. Regrettably, I must leave you at this cliffhanger. The next video picks up where this one ends on page 48, bottom stave of Dover's full score. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.